Dope sick. And so we're going to get started here just in a moment. Our meeting is going to be facilitated by Franz Giddings. And Fran, are you on yet?
No, I don't see her, bud.
Okay. All right. To kick off our meeting, our very special guest, the Attorney General of the state of Washington, Bob Ferguson, is here and ready to make some remarks. And the reason for him being here is that his office is pursuing litigation against opioid distributors, very similar to the kind of legal work that's portrayed in Dope Sick. And we really appreciate him taking the time to be with us and to illuminate what some of the issues are in terms of doing something about this horrible problem. So with that, I welcome our very distinguished guest, Attorney General Bob Ferguson.
Hey, Bud, thanks so much. And it's great to see you and everybody else, and hope you're all staying healthy. And I hope you've all gotten your booster shots. I had not gotten my booster. My wife and I had a schedule, and I couldn't go because of a work thing came up last minute. Then I didn't get it rescheduled, and I got COVID a week before Christmas. And my wife was fine, as were my kids, but I had it really bad.
Help me. I'm on a Zoom
And
meeting
so,
and my speaker is not working. Please check your connection or use a different speaker.
I think we got to get Patsy muted there.
Going on.
There we go. And so just for what it's worth, I had it really rough. And so so I should have had my booster. Encourage you to if you haven't. And but otherwise, it's great to see you and really and to talk about a subject that I mean, but as you mentioned, I've gotten a lot more involved in the opioid epidemic than I ever would have thought of when I first ran for Attorney General. And so I was asked just to say a few words maybe about these two different cases that we have that are very active right now. And I have a confession. I've not seen Dope Sick. I don't get, what's it on? It's on Netflix or something, but I don't know.
Hulu. Yeah.
Hulu, there you go. So I don't get whatever that is. Yeah. And so I have a confession. I've heard about it, but I've not seen it. But I kind of understand that it's obviously about opioids and these companies. And so, and Michael Keaton's in it, who I'm a big fan of. So, but I've not seen it. But I can obviously speak to kind of what's going on in the real world around some of the legal issues and the cases and what's at stake. And so maybe what I'll start off is by mentioning that we have a true crisis going on across our country and here in Washington State. I don't think that's a newsflash in any of you, but to put in some perspective, on average in Washington State, 2 people die every day of an opioid overdose. So that's not the number of people having an overdose, right? That's the number of people who have an overdose and die because of it. And that's been going on for a long time. And so Washington, the AG's office here, several years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I'm losing track of the years, I decided to file litigation against some of the corporations that we felt in pursuit of profits violated the law. And the result was harm to many thousands of Washingtonians. And so there are many bad actors when it comes to the opioid epidemic. We decided to go after some of the biggest bad actors who we thought were most responsible. So I'm going to sort of divide our work into 2 different lawsuits. So the first one is we filed a lawsuit against Purdue Pharmaceutical, owned by the Sackler family in a closely held corporation. And I believe that they're in the news quite a bit. The Sacklers, as you know, they're one of the wealthiest families in the United States. They're billionaires many times over. Purdue Pharmaceutical, the Sacklers company, manufactured OxyContin. Okay. And it's our contention that in promoting, advertising, selling OxyContin, I'm taking a very complex case and distilling it down. I'm going to oversimplify terribly, but in essence, saying that they downplayed the addictive, to put it mildly, they downplayed the addictive qualities of OxyContin in a way that they should have and were legally required to disclose to consumers, to Washingtonians. So in Washington State, we have a Consumer Protection Act. It's pretty simple in a way. It says you cannot engage in unfair or deceptive business practice. Well, it's unfair. It's deceptive if you do not disclose the fact that if you take these pills, there's a good chance you're getting addicted. If you get addicted, there's a good chance you're never getting out of that addiction. And there's a chance you're going to die and you'll lose the life as you know it. And they did not do that. So we filed a lawsuit against Purdue. A number of states eventually filed against Purdue, some even against Sacklers. Very few states tried to truly litigate those cases. They're expensive. They take time. Purdue can hire the best attorneys. They can bury you in motions. It's, you know, it's a challenge. So some just file and then kind of wait for a settlement. I told the team we're going to file and we're going to litigate the case. We're going to try and take it to trial. So we litigated, got through all the motions that they tried to get in our way. And we were just a couple months away from trial against Purdue Pharmaceutical when they declared for bankruptcy. That puts a stop to any trials. That bankruptcy was happening in New York. What's interesting about that bankruptcy, beyond it being Purdue and a big corporation, is that the Sackler family, which had been pulling out billions of dollars from the company once they realized these lawsuits were coming, right? And that if we were successful against them, that money would go to the state of Washington, for example. The family started pulling money out of the company. And the New York Times did a huge story about this, maybe in a series of stories about them taking that money and stashing it overseas in accounts overseas, billions of dollars. So the Sackler family, what they did is, while they're not going through bankruptcy, far from it, they're billionaires, but their company was going through bankruptcy. So what they did was they went to the bankruptcy judge and said, hey, judge, here's what we'll do. We'll toss in a couple few $1 billion into this bankruptcy, right, to pay off those states and the counties who are suing us, who are suing the company, if and only if you, bankruptcy judge, grant us, the Sackler family, and a bunch of employees, by the way, and others, a legal shield for life from any civil liability of any kind related to these issues for all time, from anybody, from you, from the Attorney General, state of Washington, from me, from anybody. Well, it's a little breathtaking, right? But the thing is, in bankruptcy court, and believe me, bankruptcy can put anyone to sleep, but you know, bankruptcy judges have a lot of power. And some bankruptcy judges believe they have the power to do that, to grant legal shields for folks not going through bankruptcy if they put money into bankruptcy. And there's a legal debate about whether or not they have the power to do that. Well, guess what? The Sacklers and Purdue Pharmaceutical, when Purdue filed for bankruptcy, a few months before they filed, they incorporated in White Plains, New York. Why did they do this? Because White Plains, New York, just coincidentally has a bankruptcy judge there, a single bankruptcy judge. And that single bankruptcy judge is well known for approving of bankruptcy plans that allow individuals to put money into a bankruptcy and get legal shields for life, and he'll approve them. You know, if you want to know why these folks can do that, they hire the best lawyers, and this is their whole life, is frankly manipulating bankruptcy law to the benefit of their clients. Even clients have done bad things. And that's what happened. So they did this in White Plains, New York. They got the judge, and guess what? The judge blessed that plan. 41 states agreed to it because they're getting money, right? And the money's going to go to good things, treatment, prevention. I mean, to be clear, right? That money's going to good things. And money would have come to Washington, but I said no to that deal with a small group of states. And Washington has really led the opposition to the bankruptcy plan. We don't think the plan is legal. We don't think you can have a plan that keeps us, a sovereign state, from suing the Sacklers. We don't think a bankruptcy judge in White Plains, New York has that power. And so we, along with Connecticut, where Purdue is based, and I think you see the Attorney General William Tong in Dope Sick. There's a scene apparently someone sent me where they show 3 or 4 AGs at press conferences announcing lawsuits against these companies. And I think you see me and you see William Tong. He speaks for a little bit. So I work very closely with William. He and I talk all the time because that's where Purdue's based, is Connecticut. So Washington, Connecticut have kind of co-led this effort. So we challenged the bankruptcy plan before a federal trial court judge. And that decision just came down a month or so ago. And the judge agreed with us. So the judge said, nope, you can't do it. You're manipulating the bankruptcy process. You can't do it. Sacklers can't do it. So the plan is blown up right now. The company, Sacklers, they're appealing that to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. That's just the next level up. And so in the coming months, we'll get a 3-judge panel. Noah Purcell, my Solicitor General, flew back to New York, by the way, to argue this at the trial court level. He did a very good job. And so it'll go to the Second Circuit. Noah will no doubt argue it again. And whatever happens at the Second Circuit, whoever loses will appeal to the US Supreme Court. And that's where this I'm confident that's where this case is going to go and will be decided. I won't go too much in the interest of time and sort of the details of the case, but maybe one thing I will just add is that, the U.S. Supreme Court has a certain orientation right now, as we all know. I do feel optimistic at the U.S. Supreme Court because I don't know, odd's the right word, but in an odd sort of way, our arguments, I think, sort of bring both sides, judges on the right and justices on the left, oversimplifying, of course, but brings them together. And here's why. Conservative justices talk a lot about states' rights, right? The power of the states. Hey, you can't interfere with state power. States have a lot of power. You can't interfere with that. It's instrumental to their orientation, their judicial philosophy, right? Well, guess what? How can one bankruptcy judge in White Plains, New York, who you've never heard of, and I'd never heard of until this case, tell every state in the country, including your state attorney general, that we, the state of Washington, cannot file a lawsuit against someone who's not bankrupt, but grafts onto a bankruptcy process and buys a legal shield for life? And that's what they're doing. They're buying it, right? How can one judge take that power away from a sovereign state? I'm confident that's a compelling argument for, sort of conservative justices. On the other side, the justices who, are considered more liberal, well, guess what? We've got this big corporation and this one of the wealthiest families in the country trying to buy a different form of justice because they're billionaires than you have and that I have and that every other American essentially has. And look, I don't know, everything what they taught me in law school is it's one set of justice for everybody, right? And that's not what this case is. The Sacklers bought a legal shield for life. That's what it is. The money may go to a good purpose. I don't doubt that. But that at the end of the day is what's happening here. And so I think that argument, right, will appeal to certain justices as well. So I think it's the kind of case that can sometimes bring together justices who may not necessarily agree on things in other contexts. So it's an important case. So that's the Sackler-Purdue bankruptcy that's going on. So stay tuned for that. When you read about that, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, that's Noah Purcell, my Solicitor General, arguing that case. He'll be doing it. He argued before. I spend a lot of my life right now thinking about, I've learned more about bankruptcy law than I ever wanted to know. I avoided taking bankruptcy law when I went to law school, but I've gotten a whole new appreciation for the importance of it. The other case we have, and this is a case that's in trial right now. In fact, it's in downtown Seattle in a King County courthouse and for a Superior Court judge, is a case we have against 3 distributors of opioids. So entirely different kind of case. Purdue's a manufacturer, right? Manufacturer of OxyContin. Different case now against 3 distributors of opioids. All 3 of these companies, think Cardinal Health, AmerisourceBergen, they're Fortune 15 corporations, not Fortune 100 or Fortune 50, Fortune 15, some of the largest companies we have. And they're distributors. And then they do what that sounds like. They distributed, they sent into, throughout a country, into communities, the opioids. So a pharmacy would make an order, doctors want the pills, they distribute it. Now, what we contend is that they have a legal obligation in distributing a dangerous product, an addictive product, that they cannot, if they see a suspicious order, they have a legal obligation not to ship those, right? And that they have to have a quality control check system in place to make sure they're not shipping pills, opioids, to a pill mill in a town in Washington state. That's not helping someone with pain because they had surgery on their knee, but feeding an addiction to somebody. It's our contention they did not have such a system, or at least it was woefully inadequate. To give you a sense of scale, just give you one statistic from a big case. We're in the middle of it. It's going to go for many months. We probably still got 2 or 3 months to go. But in Washington state, these 3 distributors distributed more opioid prescriptions, not pills, prescriptions, than there are people in a dozen counties in Washington state. Now look, I'm no expert on distribution of opioids, but those sound like red flags to me. More prescriptions than people. These are red counties, they're blue counties, they're urban counties, they're rural counties, east of the mountains, west of the mountains. Opioid addiction does not care who you are, what you look like, how wealthy you are, where you live, doesn't matter, right? It impacts everybody equally. That I have learned. And so it's our contention that, candidly, in pursuit of profits, these corporations for years just turned a blind eye to what was right in front of them. And that's not okay. So that's a case that's before Judge Scott. That's his name, the name of our judge, King County Trial Court Judge, Superior Court. And it's literally taking place in a courtroom in downtown Seattle. We actually have a break in the trial because our judge got COVID. And so, there's been a 2-week break. He's fine, which is good. And we're going to be back at it Monday. I had a lengthy briefing from my team. So in that case, to try to bring this to a close, and I'll apologize, I have to leave in a few minutes because my 13-year-old daughter has a softball practice indoors, thankfully, but 8 o'clock and I've got to get her there. So we are asking this judge, if we're successful, we're asking for billions of dollars that these corporations would pay to address the harm that they caused. So we're the first state to take these entities to trial. The stakes for these corporations, I don't want to sort of, borderline existential, right? I mean, these are huge corporations. They can handle a big penalty, but you start talking about billions of dollars, I don't care how big you are, that gets to be real money real fast for these corporations. So as you can imagine, the litigation has been, challenging, as you can imagine. But we're able to get through all the legal hurdles they put in our place. The judge issued many preliminary decisions that we thought were very favorable to us. And so we're literally in trial right now. So the state, we're presenting our case. We'll close our case here in a few weeks. Then they will present their case, and then it'll go to the judge, and it'll take him some time, I imagine, but he'll issue his decision. And so, I turned down a settlement. Most states, almost all states, accepted a settlement from these distributors. And I turned that down, as I did with Purdue Pharmaceutical. And, maybe I'll just sort of wrap up by talking about that a little bit. It's, a few $100 million is a lot of money. But, relative to what these companies did and relative to what they can pay, I felt it was too small. They don't issue an apology, to be clear, none of that. There's no executives going into a courtroom and having to testify under oath about what they knew and when they knew it. None of that would happen. And, it just seemed to me, in thinking about whether to take the deal that most of my colleagues took or to take it to trial, which has all sorts of risks, as you can imagine. If we lose this trial, that is, that's a really, really bad day for me and my office, but more importantly for Washingtonians, right? I'll have turned down a big settlement, gone to trial and lost. And that's a big risk. But I just have had a lot of conversations, especially pre-COVID times, just traveling the state, where I would talk about these cases and what was going on. And one thing I had learned was, if I was speaking at a Rotary Club in some town somewhere in the state, or giving a talk somewhere, something almost always happened if I talked about these cases. And that is, it's like clockwork. Afterwards, people come up and talk to you, but invariably somebody would come up to me and say, "Hey, Bob, can I talk to you for a second?" And they'd kind of pull me aside, and I would know exactly what they're going to say every time. If they pulled me aside, they say, "Bob, you know what? I have a son who suffers from opioid addiction," or "I suffered from this," or "my colleague at work," or someone close to them has gone through it. And the person either died or is suffering from addiction or trying to get out of it, but life-changing in all respects. And, I remember a conversation I had with one mother who lost her child and to addiction. And, I remember her saying, to me, "Hey, Bob," she said, "don't take a deal." I remember saying that. And I said, "Well, it might be a lot of money." She said, "I understand that. I know that money's important." She said, "But," she said, "what I want is for there to be some accountability. I don't want them to just write a check as the cost of doing business." She said, "Basically, I want to walk into a courthouse and see these people have to testify. And I want to see a judge issue a decision that what they did was wrong." Right? And that, in other words, that matters too, right? That having that process and have a judge say what they did was wrong, as opposed to just writing a check, denying they did anything wrong and walking away from it. And so, it's a challenge in certain respects to turn down, a few $100 million. But in thinking about it, I just came to the conclusion that was persuasive to me. And I thought, hey, if it was my kid that happened to, I think that's what I would want as well. And so I'm not saying there's not some amount of money that they could pay where I would take a deal. Of course there is, right? I just felt that the amount of money both that the Purdue was putting in and the Sacklers and that these three corporations are putting in was simply not enough. It's a lot, but it wasn't enough in terms of what they did. And so that's why, frankly, we're taking one case to the Supreme Court and one case we're in a trial with all the risks that go with that. So, maybe Bud, you can have me back in a year and we'll know if those decisions turned out to be good ones or not, right? But obviously, as you might imagine, I spend a lot of every day thinking about these cases, getting updates about these cases, talk to my colleagues around the country about the Sackler Purdue case, especially that there's a small group that's contesting it. It's a huge part of my life right now, and the team's working extraordinarily hard. I don't even want to think about how many hours they put into the trial or the Purdue Sackler case. It's a lot, and we've been at it for a long, long time. So we'll see how it turns out. One of these days, I'll have to watch Dope Sick. I kind of feel like I'm living it right now, so I'm not sure I need to see it. But I do love Michael Keaton. I think he's in it. I think Michael Keaton's in it, right? And so yes. I do love Michael Keaton. So that's going to get me to watch it when I get a little bit of free time. So I'm going to stop there, Bud, and get my daughter to softball practice. But it's great to see you all. I hope that it's helpful to give you a little context for what's going on.
It was great. We really appreciate it. Appreciate you taking time and sharing that with it. It really does give a real world perspective to it. It's just not a Hollywood movie, but it's about real life. And I, for one, admire you for what you're doing. And let's all hope that you're successful and bring these corporations to accountability.
I really appreciate it. And in all sincerity, if you ever want me to come back when this is all done, happy to do it and maybe bring a member of the trial team, because it's a fascinating trial, as you might imagine, and the evidence and what's happening. So if you ever want sort of a deeper dive, maybe post-trial, we'd be happy to come back on and talk about it, because it is fascinating, as you might imagine.
We'll take you up on that.
Can I ask?
Definitely.
Can I ask one quick question?
Sure.
It appeared that one of the real pivot that helped Purdue do what they did was that the FDA gave a special label to this particular drug. And is there anything your office can do to make the FDA accountable for something that was that reckless?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'd say, since we're in the middle of the trial, I probably won't go into too much detail about it, but so I'm not really quite sure how to answer. I guess what I'd say is we're focused on these corporations right now, who we think is especially, that said, well, I'll just say, not talking about the FDA necessarily, but, we've had litigation against smaller entities, doctors, farm. I mean, all the state's been involved in litigation of all kinds, and we're sort of open to more. Right now, what I'll say is we have our hands full. We have a lot of resources going into these efforts, and so it's a pretty big focus for us right now. But appreciate that there are, again, not speaking about the FDA specific, but there are other actors in this, right? That this is a web of activity, but we decided to focus we have limited resources on who we thought were the actors who had the biggest impact, negative impact, of course, who acted in disregard to the law, and that's how we end up with the cases we did. Hey, thanks so much to all of you. It's great to see you, and I do have to get my daughter to her softball practice. She's a pitcher on her team. She cannot be late, and I promise I'd get her there in time. But it's great seeing you. Hopefully, maybe come back at some time in the future. We can actually hopefully get together in person. Would be great as well.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, you guys. Have a great night.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right. And so next up is Franz Giddings, good loyal friend of ours and highly experienced facilitator. She facilitates, if you don't know her, Meaningful Movies, the Kirkland chapter, and does a great job with the documentaries and helping explore the issues and ramifications of that. This is a more Hollywood type TV series, but it's fact-based, and I'm sure she'll bring out a lot of good questions. So, Franz, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Bud. Let me ask you, first of all, because I am sorry, I was a wee little bit late. I saved the Zoom and it had disappeared. So, and then just as I came in, somebody else was asking me how to get in. Did you decide whether people are going to do the raise hand thing if they want to ask a question or make a comment, or how are we going to?
No, we did it. We'll defer that to you. If you'd like to have people raise hands, then Chris is on and he can handle that, can't you, Chris?
Yes, correct. We can do
Okay.
either way, France. We usually don't have enough people on that we have to do the raising hands thing, but we certainly can. It does help keep a little bit of order to it. So your choice.
Okay, well, I guess that I would like either somebody to physically raise their hand or use the little thing at the bottom that in my computer, it's the reaction area. If you hit that, you'll see a little raise hand and lower hand thing. But let's start out with, I think that Michael Keaton deserves an Oscar. I was actually teasing my boyfriend that he got so addicted to Dope Sick that he was watching it right after breakfast in the morning. And I don't know, it was tough though. It was a really tough one. So how did you all feel about going through that experience?
At times, I think it was really gut wrenching to see the portrayals that were really realistic and know that it was based on fact. Just a horrible, horrible life that greedy corporations condemn these people for without caring, and that's part of the power of it. And I hope it motivates more people to action. That was great to hear Attorney General Ferguson take the stance he did. But that was my reaction.
I was a little frustrated, frankly, that the series ended without any definitive conclusion about the disposition of the Sacklers themselves. If the Attorney General had more time, my question would have been what his goals were for the individual members, excuse me, of the Sackler family should he get that decision overturned.
Okay, Kate?
Yes, thank you for calling on me, Francis. Let's
France.
see. I should preface this with I'm over 32 years clean and sober.
Mm.
So I missed all of the pills, which I'm very grateful. But I had occasion to be called to the hospital in Everett for someone who was under 26, had overdosed on fentanyl and was on a respirator in the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And it was, it's not the first time I've seen somebody on a respirator. But the fact that this corporation were so amoral in their actions is absolutely infuriating. I'm so grateful that AG Bob Ferguson is doing what he's doing. And I'm really sad that I think that these kinds of addictions are not like alcohol. I think they're so much harder to break the cycle because they're so powerful and so immediately addictive. The ones who are experimenting, I'm a 60s, 70 child, so we experimented, and I wouldn't have survived. So that's my take on that.
Thank you. Gail?
So I was really upset that it looked to me like the Sacklers instituted a lot of the changes in how drugs are advertised on TV, how they get to the doctors, you know, our whole system was upended and turned inside out by their practices. And we're not out of that. They might, you know, be going away, but we still have all this direct advertising to us, you know, take this little pill, ask your doctor about that, you know, that kind of stuff. And, you know, they don't have a lot of these things in Europe and other countries. And yet, you know, we as Americans are bombarded with this stuff all the time. It was such an emotional roller coaster to watch what these people were going through. And I felt so terrible for them and their families. And I do know some people who have been addicted. And the other thing was kind of getting that sense of what people mean when they say that your brain has been rewired. You know, I've heard that saying before, but I think I got a real good understanding of what they mean now. I mean, they go from being, you know, good, upstanding people to, hey, how can I, you know, con you out of money or take everything that you have to get what I, you know, need today. So that was that's pretty eye-opening to me.
Or debase myself to get what I need.
Yeah.
David?
Yeah.
One of the things that I found perplexing, whether or not this is a reflection of the real Richard Sackler or an artifact of this production, he would go from being the prophet, self-anointed prophet to cure people's pain that he was committed to. And at the same time, in the same scene sometimes, he'd make statements meaning you have to maximize sales, you have to maximize profit. It seems so inconsistent. I'm just wondering if that, again, is an artifact of that production, or is that the real Richard Sackler?
Yeah, my sense, I wanted to respond to something that you said earlier, David, in terms of this film being sort of leaving us unresolved, you know, is I think that that's one of the things that we need to really go forward in paying attention to what's happening in the courts and the things that are still yet to be resolved. And with you, Gail, the idea that the advertising is still going to be a problem for other drugs, you know, my sense was that's why I asked about the FDA, because, you know, those are the folks that are supposed to protect us. Those are the folks that are supposed to regulate. And talking about Richard Sackler, you know, my sense was that what ate inside him was that he wasn't given the respect he thought he should have. And he had learned several coping skills. One of them to be that oily salesman that makes you think that everything he's got to say is, you know, the new Messiah. And the other part being, it's all about the money, and that's all my family is going to understand and value me for, is if I bring in more money than any other generation has done. But it sure was easy to hate him, eh?
It was. This is Chris. I did not raise my hand because I don't see any hands up right now. So, but I for me, one of the, I thought it was depressing. I see the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma more as a symptom of the problem rather than the problem than the problem itself. They took advantage of the system. But the real problem to me is the lack of regulatory oversight at the federal government level. So you have lack of oversight at the FDA. You have lack of ability to go after people at the DEA. You have it's like a comedy of regulatory errors and failures. And it would be funny. I say comedy. It's a dark comedy because it's not really all that funny. But that's where it all flows from, is the fact that these people could not properly regulate the very businesses, the very corporations that they are supposed to be regulating, and it all flows downhill from there.
Here, here.
Gail?
So I want to build on that. So the thing that struck me too is that in the FDA, when they were talking to Purdue, they're basically, as they stated, you know, this kind of quote unquote, talking to a possible future employer, because they could go from one day being an FDA to being employed by Purdue, which, you know, that one main guy who rewrote the label actually did.
Yeah.
So, big conflicts of interest. And we see that in lots of other ways too, in the legislative body, and the Senate and the Congress. So this is a huge issue for, I think, Americans as a whole, is that, people are using these positions of authority to then get a job later on. We make loads and loads of money.
Christy,
That's bad.
Christy, I'll get you, and then I'll get Gerald next, but I just want to say that I believe there has been legislation in this last year that is making this jump from a federal agency to a corporate position. It's made it longer, that I can't remember now whether you have to wait 5 years or 7 or something like that, but it's making it less immediately advantageous to do what the corporations want. Christy?
I was going to add on Chris's point with the FDA and just the lack of overview that they had or seem to have, and just correlate it with the FAA with Boeing, and basically saying, oh, these companies will just police themselves and they'll just take care of it and we don't have to worry about it. They're going to be good actors. They're not always good actors. They're interested in the money. And the other thing I just wanted to add, in 2008, I needed to have, I had orthoscopic knee surgery on a torn meniscus, and it was outpatient. I walked out afterwards, didn't need crutches. I'm sure I was on some kind of pain medication when I left the office because I'd had the surgeries, but I'll never forget, the doctor told me that he'd give me a prescription and he'd give me 50 pills for pain. And if I ran out of those, not to worry, I could come back and get whatever I needed. And when we went to fill the prescription, I told my husband when he went in just to get 5 pills because I didn't want 50 lying around. And he came out with all 50 and he said, well, the pharmacist said it's the same price whether you get 50 or 5. And if you didn't get all 50, you'd have to come back and get a whole new prescription. So better to get 50. I was furious because I didn't want that lying around. I had young kids.
Yeah.
And that night when I went to bed, I thought, I don't want to wake up in the middle of the night in any pain, so I'll just take one. And the next morning I woke up and I didn't feel pain. I didn't even take any ibuprofen after that point. But then I had 49 of these pills lying around. And what shocked me, I guess, is that the doctor even thought I needed 50 to begin with, and that I could have had many more. And that was in 2008. Thank goodness I knew that opioids at that point, I'd heard a lot about the addiction, which is why I didn't even have more than one. Anyway, I'm glad they're being, looks like they may be held accountable now. So I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah, and by the way, if that happens to anybody in the future, Doctors Without Borders will take unused prescriptions so that they can take them to the countries where money is not available for prescriptions.
Yeah, I just returned them to group health disposal, and who knows whatever they did with them, but I didn't want them in our house.
Right. Okay, so Gerald, or is it the other Gerald?
This is Marcy. I watched the film last night, just the first episode. And the first 10 minutes, I thought, oh, I'm just ready to turn this off. I can't even watch this. This is just depressing. And of course, as I got into it more, I just had such feelings for the people that have this kind of life through no fault of their own, other than they made a decision at one time to take 1 pill, maybe 2 pills, maybe 4. And that's it. It just happens, bing, just like that. And I thought, all these corporations that are responsible, in my mind, and should be held accountable and legally and morally and all this, I see that as a struggle with power. Power and money have become so corruptive. But I'm looking at it from another point of view as well as the corporations, and that is, as a society, the core problem in some ways is how do you raise your children? How do you raise your family, your community? When do we begin to help people? In my mind, it's actually from the moment they're born. You really have to sing to them, talk to them. In fact, my own daughter, Christy Bear, my daughter, I say to you, Christy, you have done a superb job of raising your children. And here's why. Because she's outdone me. I used to sing to my children and love them and do this and that. But she, from the moment they were born, talked to them, sang to them. They would get 5 minutes up until they're what? They're 19 or 20 now. And they still get 5 minutes every day, uninterrupted discussion time with their parents about anything they want.
That
And
that was at nighttime. We used to do that. Just but it
Yes.
was always more than 5 minutes. But
And yeah, she did tell me that. It always stretched into 20 minutes or a half hour. And I didn't even find out that she was doing this until one child came to me at about 8 years old and said, Grandma, how did that happen to you? It was some little misfortune I had when I was young. And I thought, how does my grandchild know that I had this, anyway, what I'm saying is, how do we raise our children? How do we parent them so that they are not, would I say, tempted, that they are strong enough, that they are, that they just make decisions from the moment they're young that they can deal with. And just to, I guess, it is the corporations, yes, but.
I think the thing that was important in this practice of every day is that it was a practice that became a habit. It's hard to start that kind of practice. You can talk to me about anything when the kid is 16.
Oh, yeah.
But if you started with a kid young, giving them the confidence that they can talk with you about anything, ask any question, and you're available every day, it sticks. And that's important.
And it's a good habit.
And I have to say that I felt my family raised me really well in terms of talking at the dinner table together and all kinds of other things. But think about the doctor in this situation. The doctor was bright and talented, and he came to that small town wanting to do service. He was probably raised really well. He was probably raised with the best of values. I think it's, I don't mean to be too abrupt, but I think it's a part of our privilege to assume that these things will not happen to our loved ones.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry.
It can happen to anybody, even with good child rearing.
Exactly.
Even with,
The
yes.
thing that hit me on the first episode was the counselor's statement. This man who's been living under the bridge, if we can get him cleaned up, he may be your boss
Oh, yes, that
in
comment.
2 years.
that
In other words,
comment.
this happens to everybody. It's not just for the lower half of the economic
Yeah,
people.
Anybody.
It's anybody it can happen to.
anybody.
Okay, Kate?
I think from my experience and my childhood and all of that, it would have been helpful to have been taught that there are some decisions that you make as a teenager or a young adult that are life altering, and some you cannot recover from. There are people that I knew that dropped acid that never, one time, and they never recovered from it. We weren't very, of course, we weren't very knowledgeable about that. I think we're more so. But the age of young adults and teenagers, they want to experiment, but there's some experiments that are deadly. And so that would be the one thing that I would share with children growing up. They need to know that it's possible and it's not all fun and games.
Okay, Carol, I'm not sure if you were next, but you haven't said anything, so go ahead.
Well, good evening. I too enjoyed actually the movie only because I thought it was well crafted in going from the perspective of the doctor, really, and the incredible pain that he was going through, the death of one of the children that he had delivered. I kind of think that I'm a little naive, and I think it's probably because of my age, but I've known during my lifetime people who did not use recreational drugs but were addicted. And I've also lately been reading articles through Bastille that psilocybin is one of the most lauded cures for PTSD.
Mhm.
My father was a morphine addict. He was a doctor. He was a doctor in World War II, came home with a gut that was completely eaten up with cholera. Without morphine, he couldn't eat. He couldn't process food. So he actually died of it. But I'm saying it's very painful for our veterans who come home and then don't have the resources that we're not actually giving them to stay well. You know, there's a lot of diseases out there that are not covered. Men come home with all kinds, just not one disease in their past. Morphine and what was the other one? Heroin were really expensive in the 60s. And when fentanyl came in 1959, it was really, really cheap. And what I have read about it is that the problem was it was so cheap that it wasn't mixed well. They used ice cream scoops, you know, to mix it together. So the deaths that occurred was because people just weren't exact with it. But it was so cheap, it solved so many problems in America that you've got to look at the other side of things. I don't think that we actually understand hallucinogens or even being addicted. My dad had a career for 40 years delivering babies. I never saw him under the influence, but I saw him eat. And I know what it was like to have been so, let's say, tethered to just not having pain. So, you know, we've got to look at it other ways. I can see those people in the back who had injuries. They couldn't even walk. They couldn't eat. They couldn't breathe. All the things that came from the coal industry without some relief. All right, what do we do with that? There's a huge, huge problem out there. Let's, you know, as I say, the veterans that come back and don't have access to good care. We have very, very blind eyes if we think that it is just recreational drugs. It can be a lifeline to living. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. That was incredibly eloquent. And I feel really honored that we know a little bit more about your life in a way that I had no idea. I mean, weren't you in the military?
In the Coast Guard, and there's a lot of, let's say, drug traffic in the Coast Guard. In fact, that was part of all of what they did in the Gulf Coast and on the Great Lakes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Thank
Gail's
you.
been waiting patiently, so yeah.
And, you know, very incredible discussion here. So in the late 1980s, I worked at Harborview in patient care services, and there was a huge discussion going on about pain management because people were dying from pain. Their recovery was taking really long times because of pain. You know, Harborview is the #1 trauma institute. So, you know, they were talking about what to do about all this pain, and that, you know, we needed to do something to actually acknowledge pain as a cause of, you know, all these other things that are kind of going on. It's, you know, it's very directly related with injury if you continue to have this, you know, incredible amounts of pain. So just a story from my life. In early 1990s, my mom had a big operation at Evergreen, and she was in horrible pain. Oh my gosh, you know, she didn't even want us to come see her because she was in such pain. And this went on actually, even when she got out, for 6 months. I had to call the paramedics a couple of times because she was in such pain, but they didn't believe in treating pain very much. And they were being very, very careful about it, you know, but they didn't come close to helping her to get her life back. It took over a year for her life to get back, which fortunately it did, but, you know, our family suffered from that. It was terrible. So, I mean, I understand how these people are feeling when they've had these terrible accidents. A couple years ago, I had a really bad back accident, and man, I thought I was going to die. I didn't think I was going to be able to walk again. It was so bad. Went to the emergency room, and they're like, "We're not going to give you any OxyContin or anything like that. So what do you think about that?" You know, I'm like, "I don't care. Help me." You know, unfortunately, you know, they did have other things that were developed at that time. You know, they gave me some steroids, and it was a long recovery, but I didn't go through the same thing that my mom had gone through, that some other people had gone through. You know, I still actually feel very fortunate. I felt it was horrible. It was like a 10 on my scale, but from someone else's scale, it might have been just you know, a 5 or a 6 compared to what they were doing. So anyway, the reason I'm talking about this is that I think that Purdue and the Sacklers, they used that limitation. You know, they saw that opportunity. You know, they like I said, they said they wanted to cure pain. Well, in some ways they did. They just also promoted the other side so badly, you know, that people did not benefit from it. They, you know, well, maybe some people did, but a lot of people just went to the other side. So anyway, my thing.
Well, I'd like to jump in here and get the conversation back to thinking about corporate responsibility, or the lack of corporate responsibility, and how our institutions are being corrupted. That I think we need to be more aroused and really looking at that, and because corporations just have too much power these days, and I don't have any magic solution for putting the genie back in the bottle. But I think more vigorous antitrust is part of it, more vigorous prosecutions. And that was one thing that struck me, is you saw the 2 US attorneys pursuing Sackler, but there was also the concern that they kept on talking about Maine justice, that their efforts could be thwarted because the Sacklers had lawyers working higher ups to corrupt the process. And we also saw in the series how the FDA was corrupted, and the DEA. I think Chris mentioned that earlier. So I don't want to lose sight of that. And what can we demand of our legislators, Congress people, to do something to bring these corporations to heel without destroying the entrepreneurial spirit? it's a tough thing, but it's got to happen because in my estimation, they're just out of control.
Well, I think they had mentioned in the movie too, or the series, that Germany had a lot of restrictions. And so maybe we could learn something from the Germans on how they regulate this. And I think in general, a lot of European countries do not give such power to corporations. And there's not as much corruption. I'm sure there's corruption over there, but not near the level of the US. And I think a big part of it is when, even for lobbyists who work at a lot of these companies and then get paid to go lobby Congress and legislators in state legislation and US legislation, they're given a whole lot of money and a whole lot of power to sway. And if we tighten down some of those regulations, I think those will go a long way in helping us navigate and control some of the corporate greed that occurs otherwise.
I think that it's very interesting consistently for me to see how a set of legislators think of Europe as, you know, the dark side, the socialist or whatever side, that anytime you bring up the fact that they have more consistent regulations or that they have a lot more knowledge behind the kinds of institutions that they set up, it seems like it's immediately discounted by some of those folks. And I think not only do we have to be totally on top of what's happening in our courts and get a source of news that is reliable, dependable, and not full of the ideas that put things in limited little boxes that can be then discounted. That's the first part, and then acting with whatever group that we want to focus on priorities that will start on the local level. I mean, I think Washington has done some amazing things in our legislature, and that some of the things that are passed in the Washington legislature are picked up in other states and things. I think that much as there's a focus on Congress, that it's more important for us to focus on what we can do locally and have it spread, because Congress is the hardest nut to crack. And I think that it is so entrenched that it will take a long time for really meaningful change to happen consistently on that level.
That's a good point, France. And I think we had a good demonstration of that tonight, that we have a really progressive attorney general that didn't take the easy way out and accept the initial settlements that were offered, and is trying to hold these corporations to account. But as he acknowledged, it's a risky kind of thing. But yeah, we need to support people like Bob Ferguson and demand more of our state legislature. And you know, the way things are going politically nationally, yeah, we may have to have our own bastion, become big believers in states' rights.
And I just wanted to, Fran, you haven't spoken. Go ahead.
Thank you, France. We haven't talked yet about the seductiveness of the way the corporations introduced all of this, and how they recruited salespeople and indoctrinated those salespeople to be very aggressive in their sales pitch, and wooing people with presence, or intimidating them when the wooing didn't work. I feel like there was an awful lot that went on there that I don't have any idea how to address it, but that was major to their success.
I think that there was a point in the series where they talked about some of the people who were training the salespeople being taken to court. I'm not absolutely clear, but I think I remember that they started on that end thinking that that would loosen the lips to, have then those people, when they were threatened with prison, then talk about the people higher up. And that seemed to be a little bit more problematic, but I do believe that some of those folks that were badly training the salespeople were given consequences.
Yeah, I think you're right. There was the one guy, the one salesman who sort of turned the evidence, or at least thought about it, who grabbed the videotape. I think that's part of it. But building on what Fran was saying, my dad was a pharmacist and worked for 25 or 30 years for the Upjohn Company. I don't know how many people remember the Upjohn Company, but it was at one time one of the great pharmaceutical companies in the world, and inventor of vitamins and did all kinds of things. And my dad was very successful. He was one of the top salespeople in Oklahoma, and then became head of the Kansas district, and could have gone to Kalamazoo where the headquarters were, but he just got increasingly disillusioned with exactly the sort of things we saw happening, that the ethics of it were just out the window. And the other thing he saw is that when he was recruited, the people he worked with, his fellow salesmen, were all pharmacists. By the time he left and he took early retirement, basically they were pretty boys. They were people who looked good in a suit and could talk and be trained on a very superficial level, but they didn't have the knowledge. And so I just put that together, that seems to be a trend in the pharmaceutical industry, and it's sad, but unfortunately it reflects reality.
And when was that your dad left?
Oh, a long time ago now. He worked for the Upjohn Company from like the mid 50s to probably the 70s or so. Upjohn got acquired by a Swedish company, and then that company got acquired by Pfizer, which is still around, and his pension and his health care was taken care of by Pfizer. But yeah, it's something that was happening in the industry, and like I said, he just got disillusioned with it and took early retirement at 55. And he was very, very well compensated, allowed him to do it, but that's some of the excess profits that we're all paying for, and we need to be aware of it.
So Fran, your concern sounds like, from what Bud's saying, that it's really been seriously entrenched for decades. And the longer that we understand that it has been the pattern, the more challenging it's going to be to have that turn around or be different. Christy?
I'm just thinking on what Bud's saying. Because we in our country allow prescriptions to be so high, we're allowing these companies to have even more profit, and they get caught up in the greed because our legislation is allowing them to sell these their products at such a high cost, whereas Canada has better prescription costs, Europe has better. So if we even strengthen our legislation to reduce the cost of prescriptions, that'll go a long way in curbing some of the greed that these companies have been able to get away with to date.
And that's part of the Build Back Better, that if it's not totally, it doesn't look like we're going to get the entire thing passed. It'll be chopped up into sections, and that will be the relook at the pharmaceutical, the limit on how much increase of profit they can make per year. There are a number of things in that part of Build Back Better that I think are a lot more possible to be passed and enacted. We're just going to have to do it a chunk at a time.
Well, so another question for me, based on what we're talking about, and you mentioned it early, friends, is the socialism cries, and why that works with so many people who, and I guess this is sort of the, what's the matter with Kansas argument. Why do they buy into it if they were to look at their own objective circumstances? How well are they benefiting from our economic system as it is today? And why isn't there more outrage at corporations for what they do?
I think that part of it goes to the stock market and people making money off of it at all the different levels. I think it goes to people, in effect, media representing, the economy's great. For example, back in the years of DT, or number 45 as he was also known. And a lot of people, the stock market was doing great, but individual people were doing less and less in the wealth gap that occurs. So I think that people hear things and they are led to believe there's a lot of misinformation out there, I guess. So in effect, people are brainwashed into believing certain things that just aren't true, and they don't know well enough. The information isn't correct, so they buy into the lie, I guess is how I'll put it.
Gail?
So it seems to me that a lot of the misinformation and these people starting to believe things that aren't right for themselves, and they think that they're doing good for themselves, but it's exactly the opposite, is in a large part because of radio. There's like 300 conservative talk shows that are spread out all over the US, and there's like only one or two progressive talk show hosts. And then of course the TV stations are in the hands of 5 owners now across the United States. And so, the US Congress has allowed that to happen, to kind of consolidate power for both TV stations, the newspaper, magazines, I'm not sure websites, but maybe even social media and things are all consolidated under the ownership of a small handful of people who are pushing their agenda, sometimes in subtle ways and sometimes in very outrageous ways, where you can actually see what's going on. So because I wonder that too. Why in the world would people believe this stuff? Why are they voting against their own best interest? But I think it has to do a lot with what we're hearing, seeing, and being told by people that we believe.
Okay, Jean, I saw you with your hand up and then it went down, and I know you got something to say.
Oh, thank you. Just a thought that there is a cultural issue, not just in our country, but we lead it. And that is, what is the basis of decisions that we make? Decisions about what we eat, what we invest in, petroleum products, military equipment, expensive housing versus affordable housing, money made in stocks as opposed into wages. What drives our decisions, and to what degree do we allow money and corporate and wealth to drive the decisions we make, as opposed to values and compassion and all those other things? And that's just my thought.
Okay, Christy.
Years ago, I read Al Gore's book, An Assault on Reason, and I can still remember feeling what I felt when I read this particular this particular paragraph. He basically said, there's a reason why for years the GOP in red states especially has wanted education to be underfunded and not support certain levels of curriculum, because it's in the best interest to create, they wanted to create factory workers, people that would just be happy to show up, get a paycheck, work a shift, put food on the table, roof over their head. They didn't expect a whole lot more. They maybe could provide enough for their family, but they weren't going to get, they weren't going to be able to buy yachts and things like that. They were just be happy with what they had. They had a job. And so he said, the reason, when you underfund education like that, you in effect get people that are qualified to work in factories, happy to work in factories, aren't challenged to pursue something more perhaps. And then you tell them certain things in churches or at the factory or whatever, you don't support them in a union, et cetera, and you convince them that they've got a good life. And they're okay with it up to a point. I think that if we don't have better education and better curriculum, we're going to continue on the same path. So supporting education is a big issue as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard recently that civics classes aren't being taught in high school anymore. And I don't remember having essentially a civics class, but I know I had a class that told me about representative government and, the things that we need in order to be good voting citizens. And again, voc ed and things like that are focused on what people are being taught so they can get a job. I'm sorry, Kate.
I too had that. I was really dumbfounded when I found out that civics wasn't being taught again. So I tracked that down. I think it was last year or the year before, maybe the year before, with one of the school board members. And the legislature did put in a requirement for, I think it's a half a credit. In high school, you have to have it in order to graduate, and they combine it with history, or I think that's how I remember it. But here's the kicker. They did not fund it. There's no money to teach civics in the schools. So many times they'll pass a bill and then they won't fund it. So we don't get the change. So yeah, I was like, what? No civics? No wonder we're having trouble. So, yeah.
Jean, you're on mute, hon.
My response to you, Kate, is, well, tax me. I moved here from Oregon, where there's an income tax and no sales tax. Anyway, the point is, I have never paid such low taxes in my whole life except for when I've lived in the state of Washington. But another thing about economic disparity and differences, I had the good fortune to be raised in a family and in a community where we didn't have health insurance. I mean, I think maybe once or twice my dad had a job that gave him some, but usually none. And the joke in the family was you only went to the doctor if the bone was sticking out. But the point is that the people that I grew up with and I'm related to, and that I lived in that, and my family still lives in that community, I'm not aware of a lot of misuse of prescription drugs or other drugs, because nobody has the money to do that. There are some advantages to not having a lot of money.
I'll remember that. If I could make a different point, I'm thinking about the Sacklers and how they use their money to buy respectability. And someone made a very good comment early on about how they saw Sackler as someone who didn't think he got the respect he deserved, and developed a sort of bifurcated personality, where on the one hand he was doing noble, easing pain, on the other hand he was grubbing after every dollar he could get. But part of what Dopesick portrayed is how they tried to buy respectability, the Sacklers, by funding all these things. Unfortunately, people started figuring it out and returning the money, or at least taking the Sackler name off whatever it is they thought they bought, and shaming them. And so shaming is a good cure for for some individual and corporate misbehavior.
I'll get you in a second, Kate. I was talking to a doctor today about this series, and he said, oh, if you're from the East Coast, you see Sackler all over. Everybody respects Sackler because they're just donating to everything in the world. Now, he may not have been living there recently, but it was interesting to see that perspective. Kate?
I just wanted to make 2 points, and I wanted to respond to Jean about not paying taxes here. We have 2 legs, just for information, we have 2 legs of the support stool. Our Constitution prohibits us from having an income tax greater than 1%. So it's horrible. I agree with you, but that's the reality. That's why it's so difficult. But talking about years ago, I came to the conclusion that one of the reasons that our healthcare was actually so expensive is that we no longer got the immediate feedback of how much something costs when we went into the doctor. They didn't tell us how much it was going to cost. They didn't know, because I think third parties by that time were in there. I contend that once we lost that oversight of what our healthcare actually costs, we lost control of it. So that's it.
And now we've got legislation to try to pull that back and have,
Yes.
which is, I think, much more encouraging than I've seen for years. Okay, I knew you were coming, Gail. But you have to unmute.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm actually just saying, yeah, that's great. I'm really for that. That's it.
Okay.
I was just thinking I'd love to hear from some of the folks that maybe haven't spoke yet. What were their thoughts if they were able to watch some of the series, and or what are some of the thoughts relating to the discussion thus far, just to get input if others want to add their voice in the mix. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think Robert and Vivian would have some interesting things to say. Or is that Paul? Are you about to say something?
Yes, this is Sally.
Hi, Sally.
Hi. I guess this was certainly educational to me about these drugs, the progression of how they got, higher and higher doses of them. They were trying to peddle and getting the experts, and what damage they did to communities. And I got to thinking, well, I'm going to look up, are they still being prescribed? And yes, I found out they are. It's not, this problem isn't over in our society. I guess I'd like to hear what other people say. I think it is certain unscrupulous doctors who, are pain mills that are prescribing them, but I want to get other people's perspective about that. I think it's still an ongoing problem. Maybe not as bad as it was, but it's still there. It got unleashed in our society.
And I think that's why Bob Ferguson's second suit that he's referring to, the 3 distributors, is so important, because that is, were you there for that?
Yes, that was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Marilyn?
She may be on mute.
Marilyn, I see your hand up, but we can't hear you.
All right, I was on mute. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I did not watch the series because I don't have Hulu, but I did read the book. And so my biggest fear is keeping these drugs out of the hands of children, not the prescribed drugs. I mean, they shouldn't be overprescribed, but kids, teenagers love to experiment, and they will steal to get the drugs if they get hooked, but they can get passed around at parties. I don't understand, one, how they get the money and why there is so much access. That is the worst case. I think you have more young people overdosing. I don't know the statistics, but that's the saddest part.
My daughter, when she was in high school at Lake Washington High School, the bus stop right outside the high school, she called me one day and she said, "Mom, what would be a white powder that some kid was giving to another kid?" And I went through the possible white powders it could be. And she said, "Oh, okay." And, you know, I thought, well, I work in public defense. She probably knew I would know the answer. And I was very glad that she felt like she could ask me. But the other part was friggin' right outside the high school. You know, it made me deeply sad.
I taught in a junior high once where they were passing drugs through a window from the playground into the classroom. You know,
Junior high.
A junior high, and it was basically an all-white school at that time. Louisiana has not really integrated no matter what, but what can you do? This is, to me, a very, well, the whole thing with opioids is sad, but especially with young people who overdose and die young, this has to be some way to prevent that.
I just saw Carol's hand. Your hair and that hand thing are very close to the same color, Carol.
Okay, the last 6 years that I taught in Bellevue School District, we had drug-free zones, which meant that the penalty for distributing, buying, even being caught with drugs within 100 feet of the property of the school was like triple or quadrupled. So I want you to know that they took it very, very seriously. And I'm not sure if Bellevue, or let's say Lake Washington or Seattle had drug-free zones too, but it definitely was at Bellevue.
Well, first of all, I have a flip comment. Marilyn, I'll go back to you as someone who is a proud individual from Louisiana. Have you seen the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senator who smokes a joint in his campaign commercials?
No, I have not.
Okay.
Who is it?
You want to catch that. I mean, that's a sign of the times about how things are changing in terms of drugs. And the serious point is the need to treat addiction as a public health problem and not as a criminal matter. We just make things worse when we treat it as a criminal matter.
But we still need to know who that commercial is about.
I don't remember his name. It's got a lot of play, but he is a Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate seat in Louisiana. And he's sitting in a red chair, smoking a joint and talking about how unfair the laws are against marijuana and how they need to change. So I do not remember his name.
I hate to ask this, but is he white?
No, he's not.
Okay. I have not seen it. Where did you see it?
Rachel Maddow, I think.
Okay. I must have missed that one.
I've seen it a couple of times now.
I'm sure
if you went on YouTube or Googled it, you'll find it pretty quick.
Okay. But was it a commercial on her program?
No, it was his commercial that he's showing in Louisiana, and it's so novel that other media outlets are picking it up and broadcasting it.
Thank you.
I'll do some research here.
Okay.
Well, I don't want to get us too, oh, Chris? Chris, were you saying something or?
No.
Oh, okay, your little green square around just came up, so. And Jean, now yours is up.
Oh, just, excuse me, I was just trying to find the hand thing. I think there's been a tendency in medical and dental care, medical in particular, to rather than prevent illnesses and sicknesses, and rather than diagnose, there's a tendency to go in and try to wipe out the pain or the discomfort from it and not diagnose and repair. And I think that's a basic value. And we need to address that in our medical communities. Have you ever had that situation where somebody didn't tell you what the issue was or didn't work on it, but sent you to physical therapy or gave you some drugs or did something?
Well, I think there definitely was an interest in doctors, rather than diagnosing and treating it, as you're saying, Jean. A lot of the pharmaceutical developments came along, and then there was incentives. I think these incentives for doctors are illegal now, but I remember hearing about doctors when they prescribed X amount of a certain drug, they were given expensive all paid trips for them and their families to go to these great vacation locations because they were, giving X many prescriptions of these drugs, which in turn were making the drug companies very wealthy. So doctors were interested in overprescribing certain drugs because they got benefits. So they were getting the doctors in on the greed end of it as well, which didn't do well for the rest of us who want to be treated and cured, not just given a pill that masks whatever.
Have we taken care of that issue?
I do think that those were outlawed. I don't know if they can still be strengthened. But I do believe years ago, it was made illegal to give kickbacks to the doctors who were prescribing certain medications. I guess I could look into that more, but I think even the salespeople, when they're compensated by selling a certain amount, they want to sell, and they're aggressively selling it as well. And I don't know if that has been addressed.
You would think with our technicality and our access to data that these sorts of things could be traced and recorded, and there would be responses.
Maybe, yeah. And I guess part of it is there may not be a national review of all of this. It could be that all these small areas might have the data, but it's not in a huge shared environment where everybody can look at it.
Right.
That may be part of the problem.
Carol?
This is really addressing Jeannie, but I'm not quite sure what she's talking about. Jeannie, could you elaborate a bit on? My first reaction is that pain tolerance is so varied amongst people.
Yes.
So could you just elaborate on what you just said?
Well, I was saying that if some physicians or dentists or whatever are prescribing more drugs, that could be traced. It doesn't have to, you don't have to jump to a conclusion from it, but it could be a piece of data that should be watched and followed.
Well, Jean, there is a great deal of pulling back on doctors to do prescribing, because I was at a doctor yesterday about my persistent back pain because my bottom 3 vertebrae are disintegrating. And it's not something I can do physical therapy and get totally better. And we were talking, I mentioned in passing that we were going to be talking about dope sick tonight. And so I wanted her to be really clear that I didn't want anything that was addictive or, could lead me down a bad path. But, was there something that I could do that didn't have side effects? And the first thing she said was, we're being told that we have to be extremely cautious on prescribing any kind of opiate or anything like that. And I said, no, that's good. Don't want narcotics, but it was interesting because this is only the second time I've been to her. So we're still getting to know each other, that came out right away that, and Carol, is your hand still up or are you?
No, fine. Thank you.
So I don't want to get too sideways on the main discussion, but we need to remember that tobacco and alcohol are way more addictive than any of the drugs we've been talking about tonight. And Carol, when you were talking about the veterans, there's been talk lately about the burn piles in the countries that our military has just been in, and the long-term lung and other health problems that are coming out of that the vets aren't prepared to have adequate medical care for. And in a lot of ways, people are arguing with lawyers and spending years and thousands of dollars just to get the military to agree that this was a military caused illness. So, it's the coal miners and the military who have had incredible, and the firefighters, the lung damage from all of those groups is so huge, and we're not adequately addressing that either.
Are we addressing the issue of all these issues in our public schools? Is this part of the curriculum to educate and convince people to have thoughtful lives and responsible behavior?
I have a feeling that depends from school board to school board and state to state.
Is that something we could, when was the last time you went to a school board meeting and spoke up about something? We all need to do that.
It makes it really easy now because I think most of them are on Zoom.
Mhm.
So just even attending a Zoom meeting or two and realizing how we can affect change here
Mhm.
goes a long way in helping.
Yeah, I was at the, I guess it was the Redmond School Board. No, it must have been Lake Washington School Board in this last year, talking about racial equity and how to have a plan in place for that.
Mhm. These are issues that could be discussed and taught in lots of places: families, churches, schools, businesses. How do we teach and raise up our community?
One thing I'll mention is that I've been serving on the Lake Washington School District Social Science Curriculum Redesign Team. And I got on there out of Reading Liberally to promote the use of the 1619 project, if you know what that is.
Yeah.
And I've been really impressed that the way the project is going at this time is that it really is introducing very advanced concepts in terms of racial equity. And I really admire what's going on. I'm also very nervous at what point do the critical race theory objectioners go into full cry to try to shout them down. But they're really doing really good work, and I'm proud to be associated with it. And I just hope they see it through. So a couple of other points. I did look it up and posted it on the chat. The person in Louisiana, the Democratic candidate, is Gary Chapman Jr., and he's actually a social justice activist. So he's not just being flipped. He's making the point of the disparate arrest records of blacks in Louisiana versus whites in terms of marijuana possession. So in a way, it's a very serious kind of campaign issue. And I personally wish him luck on that. But I did post his name and a link to the video in the chat.
Good, thank you.
So Carol, is your hand up or not?
Yes, it is. I'd like to say one last thing. I think that we're just on the brink of realizing that just like a bell-shaped curve, some drugs are good for us, and they are the answer to some problems like terminal cancer. Marijuana has been wonderful for that. I think that we are learning that back in the 1960s, when our artists were taking trips and then coming out of them and being incredibly more artistic than any of us realized. I mean, we all related to it, but we didn't know why. I think that we're coming out now to realize that there is a place in human development and in all of our history for drugs. Now, which ones work for us and which ones do not? What is really addiction? You know, just with alcohol and as you said, caffeine, nicotine, you know, we're all of those. So I think we can't just go with a scare. There's going to be incredible things in the future for generations that we can't even imagine. And I think we're just on the brink of it. So thank you for listening to me.
Michael Pollan's newer book talks about the ability to treat depression and various other mental illnesses with psychedelics. And I just wanted to mention back in history, because because Bud brought this up about the work in terms of I always screw up numbers, 1619?
1619.
Yeah, that I think most of you may be aware that the difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine was the perception that upper class white guys did the powder cocaine, and the cheaper crack cocaine was what the poor people could afford. And those were the folks that went into the penitentiary for really, really, really long terms. Whereas the first offense, especially for powder cocaine, was often reduced to a misdemeanor. So, you know, that's another part of our racial history that involves drugs.
We can all learn something, can't we? And we can each one teach one. I was raised in a house. Both of my parents were Sunday school teachers, you know, and neither of them had the college education, but they were good teachers. And we can continue to teach, you know. And 4 of my 5 brothers and sisters, we became teachers because that was a step up in our community.
I wanted to address a issue. Someone, I'm responding to something, and I can't remember quite who said it, but what I was reminded of is that the Sacklers and Purdue used a well-used playbook of when they were trying to combat the investigations into what they were doing, is they learned from big tobacco. They learn from the vicious attacks on Rachel Carson, is that what you do as a big corporation is you raise doubts about the science and the fact that there's nothing that you can ever absolutely definitely prove as a way of forestalling any kind of action against it. And the Sacklers used that. And it's been used by the petroleum industry and climate change. I said tobacco, pesticides in terms of Roundup. We have a local problem here that we're trying to deal with. And the justification is, well, you can't fully prove that Roundup causes cancer, even though
bullshit.
people are dying from it. Okay, and so that is one of the dishonest rhetorical devices that lawyers use. And as consumers, as citizens, we've got to become much more knowledgeable and sophisticated to push back against that kind of dishonest tactic.
And,
Look at
Bud,
the
the Canadian Supreme Court came out years ago now saying with Roundup, and Roundup is not sold anywhere in Canada. In fact, I knew somebody who got busted bringing Roundup into Canada.
Oh.
But yeah, but the Supreme Court said not that there is, proof like in criminal court, but if there is if there is a substantial belief or understanding that Roundup could be damaging to a community has the right to pull that off any of their parks or any public or private use. Preponderance is that what they said. If it was a preponderance of evidence that this could be a problem, the community has the right to withdraw it. And I thought that was brilliant.
Absolutely, and that's what we need to do in terms of American jurisprudence. I mean, we're literally talking about a next door neighbor, and we're afraid to let our cat out because we're afraid that she's going to be harmed by it because he just used it as the answer to everything. But
Yeah.
it is a just well-worn tactic, but it's used because it continues to work, and people get suckered into it either because they're ignorant or because it's to their advantage to buy these lies. It's basically a lie. It's just an attempt to forestall dealing with the consequences of something bad.
Okay, I don't know whether Chris